The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine tarmac of Manhattan Private Airport as Captain Thomas Wright adjusted his perfectly pressed uniform in the reflection of his private jet's polished exterior. At 52, he stood tall and proud, his graying temples only adding to his distinguished appearance. Every button gleamed, every crease sharp, exactly what his high-profile clients expected from their pilot. 15 years of flying the world's elite had taught Thomas everything about luxury service. He knew how to make billionaires feel safe, how to handle celebrities' unusual requests, and most importantly, how to maintain the perfect balance of professionalism and sophistication that private aviation demanded. His expertise had earned him a reputation as one of the most reliable pilots in the industry, and he guarded that reputation fiercely. "Weather report just came in, Captain," called out his co-pilot, Robert, walking across the tarmac with a tablet in hand. "Clear skies all the way to Los Angeles. Should be a smooth flight." Thomas nodded, his eyes scanning the sleek white jet before him. The aircraft was a masterpiece of engineering, a $65 million marvel that could cross continents in unparalleled comfort. He ran his hand along the smooth surface, a habit he developed over years of service. Every flight began with this ritual, a moment to connect with the machine he'd trust with not just his life, but the lives of those who could afford to travel in such style. The early morning airport staff bustled around them, preparing for another busy day. Fuel trucks hummed in the distance, and the distinct sound of mechanical stairs being positioned echoed across the private terminal. Thomas checked his watch, a gift from a grateful client, and noted they were right on schedule for their 9 a.m. departure. Inside the cockpit, Thomas began his meticulous pre-flight routine. Each switch, each dial, each reading had to be perfect. He developed this attention to detail early in his career, flying cargo planes before making the jump to private aviation. Now, as he sat in the captain's seat of one of the most expensive private jets in the world, that same dedication had become second nature. "Cabin crew reports they're ready," Robert announced, settling into the co-pilot's seat. "Catering has loaded the client's special requests, including that specific mineral water from Norway they asked for." Thomas smiled slightly. He'd seen all kinds of requests over the years, from rare champagnes to exotic pets to last-minute flight plan changes for spontaneous shopping trips in Paris. Today's flight to Los Angeles seemed relatively straightforward in comparison. Just another routine trip carrying someone important enough to afford their own private transport across the country. The morning light streamed through the cockpit windows as Thomas reviewed the flight plan one more time. Los Angeles was experiencing perfect weather, typical for Southern California. The flight path would take them over some of America's most spectacular landscapes, something his usual clients rarely bothered to notice, too absorbed in their phones or laptops to appreciate the view. Ground crew members moved efficiently around the aircraft, their orange vests bright against the gray tarmac. Thomas watched them through the window, mentally checking off each preparation step. He learned long ago that in private aviation, the smallest details could make the biggest difference. His passengers didn't just pay for transportation, they paid for perfection. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow across the airport, Thomas felt that familiar surge of pride. This was his domain, a world of luxury, precision, and excellence. Each flight was a testament to his skill, his professionalism, and his understanding of what true luxury service meant. Little did he know that today's flight would challenge everything he thought he knew about his role and the industry he devoted his life to serving. The clock ticked closer to departure time, and Thomas straightened his tie one final time. In just a few minutes, their passenger would arrive, and another journey would begin. But this wouldn't be just another routine flight across the country, though Thomas had no way of knowing that yet. For now, he was simply the consummate professional, ready to deliver another perfect private flight experience, exactly as he had done thousands of times before. The private terminal's glass doors slid open, and Thomas glanced up expectantly, ready to greet another well-heeled client. Instead, he saw a woman who seemed entirely out of place in the world of private aviation. She wore simple black slacks and a navy blue blazer that, while neat, clearly hadn't come from any high-end designer. Her practical shoulder-length hair was pulled back in a simple style, and she carried her own rolling suitcase, something Thomas hadn't seen in years at this terminal. This can't be right, he muttered under his breath, checking his flight manifest again. He was expecting someone different. Usually, his passengers arrived in chauffeur-driven luxury cars, accompanied by an entourage of assistants handling their every need. This woman walked alone, pulling her carry-on with one hand while clutching a worn leather laptop bag in the other. The morning sun caught her face as she paused to look up at the aircraft. There was something quietly confident about her expression, but Thomas had already made up his mind. She had to be someone's assistant, probably sent ahead to prepare the cabin for the actual client. He'd seen it before. Staff members taking advantage of empty legs on private flights while their employers traveled by other means. "Good morning," she called out with a warm smile, her voice carrying across the tarmac. Thomas deliberately turned away, busying himself with his clipboard. Let the flight attendant handle the support staff, he thought. He had more important things to do than chat with an assistant. Through the corner of his eye, he watched as she approached the aircraft's stairs. Her rolling suitcase made a soft, rumbling sound against the tarmac, so different from the usual parade of designer luggage that ground crews typically loaded. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, taking in the magnificent aircraft with what looked like genuine appreciation. The flight attendant, Lai, hurried down to greet her. "Welcome aboard. May I help you with your bag?" "That's kind of you, but I can manage," the woman replied, her voice carrying a hint of warmth that made Thomas glance up despite himself. She introduced herself simply as Anne, offering no last name or title. Thomas shook his head slightly, definitely not their usual clientele. As she made her way up the stairs, Thomas noticed something else unusual. Unlike most passengers who treated private jets as their personal property, she moved with a kind of respectful awareness, careful not to scuff the pristine white paint with her rolling suitcase. She even paused to admire the craftsmanship of the handrails, something that actually made Thomas feel a flicker of approval before he caught himself. Inside the cabin, Lee's voice drifted out as she offered the standard pre-flight services. "Would you like champagne before takeoff? Or perhaps some fresh-pressed juice?" "Just water would be perfect, thank you," came the reply, followed by some quiet questions about the aircraft's safety features. Another departure from the norm. Most passengers were too busy with their phones to pay attention to safety briefings. Robert, the co-pilot, stepped out of the cockpit and gave Thomas a puzzled look. "Something seems different about this one," he whispered. "Did we get updated passenger information?" Thomas waved off the question, probably just filling an empty seat. "You know how it goes. Executives sometimes send their people ahead." He straightened his shoulders and focused on the pre-flight checklist, determined not to let this unusual situation disturb his routine. But as he went through his final preparations, he couldn't shake a nagging feeling that he was missing something important. The woman's quiet confidence, her careful observations, the way she carried herself. It all hinted at something that didn't quite fit his hasty assumptions. Still, he pushed these thoughts aside. After all, he had a flight to prepare for, and years of experience had taught him exactly what kind of people chartered private jets. As the cabin door closed with a gentle thud, Thomas heard the passenger talking quietly with Lai about the weather in Los Angeles. There was something in her voice, a blend of authority and genuine interest, that made him pause for just a moment. But he quickly dismissed the thought. He had a job to do, and whoever this woman was, she wasn't the type of client he was used to impressing. Little did he know, this flight would teach him one of the most important lessons of his career. The pre-flight checklist usually brought Thomas a sense of calm, but today something felt off. He could hear the passengers' quiet movements in the cabin behind him, so different from the usual demanding voices and constant phone calls he was used to. He deliberately kept his back turned as he heard footsteps approaching the cockpit. "Excuse me, Captain." The woman's voice was polite, but carried a note of authority that Thomas chose to ignore. He continued flipping switches and checking gauges, pretending to be too absorbed in his work to respond. Let Robert handle it, he thought. His co-pilot quickly stepped in. "How can we help you, ma'am?" "I was wondering about our flight path today. I noticed some weather systems over the Midwest." Her question showed an unexpected knowledge of aviation, but Thomas merely grunted and kept his eyes fixed on the instruments. Robert gave their passenger a thorough explanation of the planned route, while Thomas silently fumed. In 15 years of flying private jets, he developed a sixth sense about passengers, and this one simply didn't belong. The way she asked intelligent questions about the aircraft systems only irritated him more, as if an assistant needed to know about thrust capacity and cruising altitudes. The flight attendant, Lai, appeared in the cockpit doorway with a concerned look. "Captain, perhaps you'd like to explain the—" "I'm busy with essential pre-flight procedures." Thomas cut her off, his voice clipped. He heard a soft sigh behind him, but kept his attention focused on the displays. The sooner they got this flight underway, the better. As the passenger returned to her seat, Lai lingered in the cockpit. "Sir, I really think you should." "Not now." Thomas interrupted again, his jaw tight. "We have a schedule to maintain." He could feel Li's disapproval, but he'd learned long ago that maintaining proper boundaries with support staff was crucial in this industry. Through the cabin audio system, he could hear the passenger quietly working, the soft tapping of laptop keys and occasional rustle of papers. No phone calls, no demands for special services, no complaints about the cabin temperature. It was almost pleasant, but Thomas refused to let that change his mind. When it came time for the safety briefing, Li's voice carried her usual professional charm, but there was tension underneath. The passenger asked several thoughtful questions about emergency procedures, questions that actually impressed Thomas, though he'd never admit it. "The emergency exit row has additional responsibilities," the passenger noted. "I'd be happy to assist if needed." Thomas couldn't help but rolled his eyes. In his experience, real VIPs never volunteered for anything. They expected others to handle all responsibilities while they enjoyed their champagne and caviar. As they prepared for takeoff, Robert tried one more time. "Captain, maybe we should properly introduce ourselves to." "Focus on your pre-flight checks," Thomas said firmly. He'd made up his mind about this passenger, and he wasn't about to change it now. The hierarchy of private aviation was clear to him. Pilots at the top, actual clients just below, and support staff far beneath. He'd worked too hard to reach his position to start blurring those lines now. The engines hummed to life, their powerful vibration filling the cockpit. Thomas ran through his final checks with practiced efficiency, his movements precise and automated. Behind him, he could hear Lai securing the cabin and their passenger typing away on her laptop, probably preparing some presentation for her boss, he assumed. Little did Thomas know that every moment of his behavior was being carefully observed and noted. His dismissive attitude, his refusal to engage, his obvious disdain, all of it was painting a picture that would soon come back to haunt him. But for now, he sat confidently in his captain's seat, absolutely certain that he was doing everything exactly as he should. As the jet began to taxi toward the runway, Thomas allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Soon they'd be at cruising altitude, and he wouldn't have to worry about maintaining his professional distance anymore. The irony of his situation was completely lost on him as the powerful aircraft rolled forward, carrying him toward a lesson that would change his entire perspective on what it meant to be truly professional. The jet climbed smoothly through the morning sky, leaving Manhattan's skyline behind. Thomas handled the controls with his usual expertise, but there was an unusual tension in the cockpit. Every few minutes, Lai would appear with another concerned glance, which Thomas steadfastly ignored. He'd been flying long enough to know he was right about this passenger. "Captain." Lee's voice was barely above a whisper as she leaned into the cockpit. "Our passenger would like to know if we could adjust our altitude slightly to avoid some turbulence she noticed on the weather radar." Thomas tightened his grip on the controls. "Since when do passengers have access to weather radar data?" he muttered, but Robert was already pulling up the weather display. To Thomas's annoyance, their passenger's suggestion was actually spot on. There was indeed a patch of turbulence at their planned cruising altitude. "She seems to know quite a bit about aviation," Robert commented carefully, adjusting their flight plan. Maybe we should remember our roles here," Thomas cut in. "We're not running a flying classroom for curious staff members." He could feel Robert's disapproval, but chose to ignore it, just as he'd been ignoring everything else that didn't fit his view of how things should be. Through the cabin audio system, they could hear Lai chatting with their passenger. The conversation revealed more surprising knowledge. Discussions about aircraft systems, international flight regulations, and corporate aviation trends. Thomas found himself listening despite his determination not to be impressed. "The new fuel efficiency standards are really changing the industry," the passenger was saying. "Especially for long-range private jets like this one." Thomas snorted quietly. "Probably read that in some magazine," he whispered to Robert, but even he had to admit her analysis was surprisingly well informed. The flight progressed smoothly, but the atmosphere grew increasingly uncomfortable. Lee kept making excuses to visit the cockpit, trying to prompt Thomas to properly acknowledge their passenger. Each time, he found a new reason to be busy with instruments or radio communications. The passenger would like to know if we could explain the approach procedure for Los Angeles. Lai tried again, about 2 hours into the flight. "I'm sure you can handle it," Thomas replied dismissively, though he noticed his own voice had lost some of its usual confidence. There was something about this passenger's questions. They were too precise, too knowledgeable. They weren't the questions of someone merely trying to appear important. Robert kept shooting him meaningful looks, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "You know, Thomas, in all my years of flying, I've never met an assistant who knew this much about aviation. Maybe we should." "Maybe we should focus on flying the aircraft," Thomas interrupted, but his words lacked their earlier conviction. A nagging doubt had begun to creep in, though he fought hard to suppress it. The passenger's voice drifted forward again, this time discussing corporate responsibility in private aviation with Lai. Her comments were insightful, showing a deep understanding of both the business and technical aspects of the industry. Thomas found himself straining to hear more, even as he maintained his aloof demeanor. "Did you enjoy the view of the Midwest?" Lai asked their passenger, trying once again to create a bridge between the cockpit and cabin. "Beautiful as always," came the reply, followed by a comment about how different the landscape looked compared to when she'd surveyed potential sites for new private aviation facilities. Thomas felt his stomach tighten slightly. Surveyed sites. That wasn't something a typical assistant would be involved in. For the first time, he felt a flutter of real uncertainty about his assumptions. Still, he held onto his professional distance like a shield. After all, he built his career on understanding the private aviation world and its peculiar hierarchy. He'd learned to read people, to know their place in the complex social structure of luxury travel. He couldn't be wrong about this. Could he? As they crossed into the third hour of flight, the tension had become almost physical. A presence in the cockpit as real as the instruments before him. Lee's attempts to bridge the gap had grown more pointed, Robert's silence more pronounced, and Thomas' certainty. Well, that was beginning to show its first real cracks. The gentle hum of the jet engines filled the cockpit as they cruised at 40,000 feet. Thomas had just finished another routine check when his tablet lit up with an urgent message notification. The company rarely contacted pilots mid-flight unless something important was happening. He tapped the screen, expecting a simple weather update or route modification. His heart nearly stopped as he read the first line. Attention all flight crew. This is a priority notice regarding today's VIP passenger. The message continued, and with each word, Thomas felt the color drain from his face. His hands began to tremble slightly as he read further. We are pleased to announce that Ms. Ann Chen, our newly appointed CEO, is conducting on-site evaluations of our flight operations across the country. She has specifically chosen to travel incognito to assess our service standards in their most natural state. The tablet suddenly felt heavy in his hands. Ann Chen, the new CEO who had made headlines for turning around struggling companies through hands-on leadership. The same person who had revolutionized 3 major corporations by starting her evaluations from the ground up. The same person he'd been coldly ignoring for the past 2 hours. Everything okay, Captain? Robert asked, noticing his distress. Thomas wordlessly handed him the tablet. As Robert read, his eyes widened, and he whispered, "Oh no." Through the cabin audio system, they could hear their passenger, their CEO, speaking quietly with Lai about the company's future plans for sustainability in private aviation. Every word now took on new meaning, revealing not just knowledge but clear authority and vision. "She's been dropping hints all morning," Robert said softly, shaking his head. "All those questions about company policy, the technical knowledge, the site surveys." Thomas sat frozen, his mind racing through every dismissive gesture, every ignored greeting, every moment he'd chosen to reinforce what he now realized was nothing but his own prejudice. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him harder than any G-force he ever experienced. Lai appeared in the cockpit doorway, her expression a mix of sympathy and "I tried to tell you." She held another tablet, displaying an article about Ann Chen's unique approach to corporate leadership. The photo showed their passenger, their CEO, accepting an award for innovative business practices. The crew meals were lovely, by the way. Their CEO's voice came through the cabin audio. "It's good to see we're taking care of our flight staff properly." Even now, after hours of dismissive treatment, she was showing concern for crew welfare. Thomas's throat felt dry as he realized something else. The company had recently announced a major initiative to combat elitism and discrimination in private aviation. They were planning to transform the industry's culture, making it more inclusive and respectful at all levels. And he, one of their senior captains, had just provided a perfect example of exactly what needed to change. The autopilot beeped softly, a routine sound that suddenly seemed to echo his own automatic, unthinking behaviors. How many other times had he judged passengers based on their appearance? How many opportunities had he missed to learn from others because he decided they weren't worth his attention? "We should probably prepare the descent briefing," Robert suggested gently, trying to help Thomas focus on the immediate tasks at hand. But Thomas could barely concentrate on the flight instruments. In just a few hours, they would land in Los Angeles, and he would have to face the consequences of his actions. A subtle turbulence shook the aircraft, matching the tremor in Thomas's hands as he adjusted the controls. The clear blue sky outside seemed to mock the storm brewing inside his mind. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on being the consummate professional. Now he realized that true professionalism meant something very different from what he'd always believed. The next hour of flight felt like the longest in Thomas's 20-year career. Every sound from the cabin made him flinch, every crackle of the radio made his stomach tighten. His mind kept replaying the morning's events, but now he saw them through entirely different eyes. He remembered her first approach to the aircraft, rolling her own suitcase. At the time, he'd seen it as proof she didn't belong. Now he understood. She'd been demonstrating the humility and hands-on leadership that had made her famous in the business world. While he'd been judging her clothes, she'd been evaluating his character. "We're about 2 hours from Los Angeles," Robert announced over the cabin intercom, his voice steady despite the tension. Thomas noticed he'd taken over most of the passenger communications, a small kindness he didn't deserve. Through the cabin audio, They could hear their CEO speaking quietly with Lai about employee welfare programs. Every position matters, she was saying. From maintenance crews to flight attendants to pilots. Everyone deserves respect. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He thought about his own daughter, who was studying engineering in college. How many times had he told her that merit mattered more than appearance? How many times had he praised her for breaking stereotypes? Yet here he was, embodying the very prejudices he claimed to reject. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the altitude control. A memory surfaced. Last year's company memorial for a veteran flight attendant. The CEO had flown in specifically to attend. He'd read about it in the company newsletter. Now he understood why. She wasn't just running a company, she was building a community. I should have known, he whispered, more to himself than to Robert. All those questions about fuel efficiency and flight paths, they weren't just curiosity. She was checking if I'd bother to explain things to someone I thought was beneath my position. Robert nodded quietly. Remember when she mentioned the new training facility in Denver? She wasn't reading it in a magazine. She was the one who approved the project. Thomas felt a fresh wave of shame. He dismissed her knowledge as superficial, assuming she'd picked up a few aviation terms to sound important. In reality, she probably knew more about the company's operations than he did. Lai appeared in the cockpit again, her expression gentle despite everything. The CEO would like to know if we could adjust our approach to avoid the thunderstorms building near Los Angeles. Thomas checked the weather radar. Once again, their CEO's suggestion was spot on. The storms were still small, but growing quickly. He'd been so distracted by his own thoughts that he hadn't noticed them developing. Tell her we'll adjust course accordingly, he managed to say, his voice rough. Lai gave him an encouraging nod before returning to the cabin. As he modified their flight plan, Thomas thought about all the times he'd automatically assumed he knew best. How many talented people had he dismissed because they didn't fit his narrow view of what success looked like? How many valuable insights had he missed because he thought he already knew all the answers? The sun was starting to set outside his window, painting the clouds in shades of gold and pink. Normally, this was his favorite part of westbound flights, watching days slowly fade into evening. Today, it felt like a countdown to the moment he'd have to face the consequences of his actions. You know what the worst part is? He said quietly to Robert. She's been nothing but professional this entire flight. Even after how I treated her, she's still thinking about the crew's welfare and the safety of the aircraft. She's showing exactly the kind of leadership I should have been displaying all along. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years building a reputation as one of the company's most professional pilots, only to have it crumble in a single flight because he'd forgotten what professionalism really meant. The Los Angeles sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks as their jet made its final approach. Thomas's normally steady hands felt heavy on the controls as he guided the aircraft toward the runway. Through the windshield, he could already see two dark company cars waiting on the tarmac, and his heart sank even further. Smooth landing, Captain, Robert said quietly as the wheels touched down with barely a bump. Under different circumstances, Thomas would have felt pride in the perfect touchdown. Now, it felt meaningless compared to his larger failure. As they taxied to their parking position, Thomas caught sight of two figures standing near the company cars. Even from a distance, he recognized the regional director's tall frame and the unmistakable presence of the head of flight operations. Their unexpected appearance confirmed his worst fears about what was coming. The engines wound down to silence, but the quiet felt oppressive rather than peaceful. Thomas completed his shutdown checklist mechanically, each familiar action a reminder of how routine this flight should have been. Behind him, he could hear their CEO quietly thanking Lee for her excellent service. "Would you like me to handle the final paperwork?" Robert offered, trying to give Thomas a moment to collect himself. But Thomas shook his head. He needed to face this situation directly, no matter how difficult it might be. As they opened the cabin door, the warm California air rushed in. Thomas stood at attention, his uniform perfectly pressed, but offering no protection against what was to come. He watched as their CEO thanked each crew member personally, showing the kind of genuine appreciation he should have displayed from the start. The head of flight operations approached the aircraft first. "Captain Wright," she said, her tone professional but cool. "We'll need you to come with us for a debrief." The regional director stood a few steps behind her, his expression unreadable. Thomas noticed their CEO had pulled out a small notebook. Throughout the flight, she'd been documenting everything. His dismissive attitude, his refusal to engage, his clear display of prejudice. Now those notes would become part of his permanent record. "Your conduct today has been thoroughly documented," the regional director said, his voice low enough that only Thomas could hear. The CEO was particularly interested in how you would treat someone you assumed was beneath your position. Thomas felt his face burn with shame. The worst part was knowing that everything, every mistake, every assumption, every moan of arrogance, had been entirely his own doing. No one had forced him to act that way. He had chosen to show the worst version of himself, and he had done it to the one person who had the power to reshape not just his career, but the entire company's culture. "We've reviewed the preliminary report," the head of flight operations continued. "It shows a pattern of behavior that directly contradicts our company's core values." Through the corner of his eye, Thomas could see their CEO speaking with Lai and Robert. Even now, she was gathering more perspectives, learning about the day-to-day realities of their operations. He had mistaken her modest appearance for insignificance, while she had been demonstrating exactly the kind of leadership the company needed. The warm evening air felt thick with tension as Thomas followed the two executives toward their cars. Behind him, he could hear the ground crew beginning their post-flight checks, the normal rhythm of airport life continuing as if his world hadn't just been turned upside down. "Your actions today will have consequences," the regional director said as they reached the cars. "But more importantly, they've revealed a mindset that we're working to eliminate from our industry. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Thomas turned to look back at the aircraft, its sleek form silhouetted against the darkening sky. In all his years of flying, he'd never felt so small, so humbled. The true measure of his professionalism had been tested today, and he had failed spectacularly. The conference room at the Los Angeles private terminal felt smaller than usual. Thomas sat straight-backed in his chair, his captain's stripes gleaming under the bright lights, as he waited for the meeting to begin. The views of the airfield through the windows would normally have caught his attention, but today he could barely lift his eyes from the polished table surface. The door opened quietly, and Thomas stood as the CEO entered, followed by the head of flight operations. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to maintain his professional composure. The CEO had changed from her simple travel outfit into a business suit, but she carried herself with the same quiet confidence he'd ignored earlier. "Please, sit down, Captain Wright," she said, her voice carrying the same warmth she'd shown to the flight crew earlier. This only made Thomas feel worse. Her professionalism in the face of his poor behavior was a sharp reminder of his failures. She opened the notebook she'd been writing in during the flight. "I want to discuss what happened today," she began. "But first, I'd like to hear your perspective. What do you think went wrong?" Thomas took a deep breath. He'd been preparing for this moment during a long walk to the conference room. "I made assumptions," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Terrible, unfair assumptions based on nothing but appearances. I forgot that true professionalism means treating everyone with respect, regardless of who I think they might be." The CEO nodded slowly, turning a page in her notebook. "You're one of our most experienced captains," she said. "Your flight record is nearly perfect. Your technical skills are outstanding. But today showed us something important about the culture we need to change." She slid a document across the table. Thomas recognized it as his own performance reviews over the years. All excellent. Your skills in the cockpit have never been in question, she continued. But our company is trying to build something bigger than just technical excellence. We're trying to create an environment of genuine respect and inclusion. The head of flight operations spoke up. We have two options for you, Captain. He placed another document on the table. The first is resignation, effective immediately, with full benefits and a positive reference focusing on your technical capabilities. Thomas felt his stomach clench. 15 years of service ending in disgrace. But then the CEO spoke again. The second option is more challenging, she said, pulling out another folder. We're launching a new mentorship program aimed at bringing more diversity into private aviation. We need experienced pilots to help train the next generation. Pilots who understand firsthand why culture change is so important. Thomas looked up, surprised. You trust me with that responsibility. After today. Sometimes, the CEO said quietly, the best teachers are those who have learned from their mistakes. Your experience today, both the errors in judgment and your recognition of those errors, could be invaluable in helping others avoid the same pitfalls. She outlined the program, 6 months of intensive sensitivity training, followed by a position as lead instructor for new pilots from diverse backgrounds. He would need to work closely with crew members at all levels, breaking down the hierarchical barriers he helped maintain. It won't be easy, the head of flight operations warned. You'll be starting over in many ways, rebuilding trust, learning new perspectives. Some days will be humbling. Many will be challenging. All will require you to keep growing and learning. Thomas looked at the two options before him. The resignation letter would be easier, a quick exit, a chance to start fresh somewhere else. But as he thought about his daughter studying engineering, facing her own battles against prejudice, he knew what he had to do. I'd like to take the second option, he said firmly. I want to be part of the solution. I want to help build the kind of industry where what happened today never happens again. The CEO smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say, she replied. Because changing a culture requires people willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work to correct them. It requires people brave enough to learn and grow, even when it's uncomfortable. 6 months later, Thomas stood at the front of a bright classroom at the company's new training center. 20 faces looked back at him, the first class of the Diversity Initiative flight program. The walls were decorated with photos of aviation pioneers from all backgrounds, a reminder of how many different paths could lead to the cockpit. Welcome to your first day of private aviation training, he began, his voice carrying the warmth and respect he'd learned to show to everyone. My name is Captain Wright, and my job is to help you become the future of this industry. But first, I want to tell you a story about the most important lesson I ever learned. He glanced at the back of the room, where the CEO sat quietly observing. She gave him an encouraging nod, and he continued. 6 months ago, I was a different person. I thought I knew everything about being a professional pilot. I was wrong. As he shared the story of that fateful flight, he could see recognition in many of the students' eyes. They'd faced similar prejudices, similar dismissive attitudes. But now they were part of the change. Being a great pilot isn't just about handling the aircraft, he explained, walking between the desks. It's about understanding that everyone deserves respect, regardless of how they look or what they wear. Sometimes, the most important lessons come from the people we least expect to teach us. The training program had transformed over the past months. Instead of just technical skills, it now included modules on emotional intelligence, cultural awareness, and authentic leadership. Thomas had helped design many of these changes, drawing from his own experience of learning humility. During the lunch break, he caught up with Lai, who had become one of the program's most valued instructors. Remember that flight? She asked with a smile. You've come so far since then. Thanks to you, Thomas replied. You tried to warn me that day. Now I understand why. Lai had been promoted to head of cabin crew training, her experience and insight finally getting the recognition they deserved. In the afternoon, Thomas led a simulator session. He watched proudly as a young student who'd never seen the inside of a private jet before smoothly handled an emergency scenario. Excellent decision-making, he praised, remembering how he'd once withheld such encouragement based on appearances. After classes ended, the CEO stopped by his office. The same simple, practical style he'd once dismissed now represented to him the essence of true leadership: substance over show, respect over hierarchy. "How are they progressing?" she asked, genuinely interested in each student's journey. "Incredibly well," Thomas replied. "They'd bring such different perspectives to problem solving. I'm learning as much from them as they are from me." She smiled, picking up one of the training manuals he'd helped revise. "You know, that flight changed more than just your career. Your story has become a turning point for our entire company culture." It was true. The incident had sparked a company-wide transformation. Other senior pilots, inspired by Thomas's honesty about his mistakes, had stepped forward to help mentor new talent. The old hierarchies were breaking down, replaced by a culture of mutual respect and continuous learning. "Next week, we're expanding the program," the CEO announced. 3 more training centers across the country. We'd like you to help set them up." Thomas felt a surge of pride, not in himself, but in being part of something bigger. Looking out the window at a student practicing pre-flight checks on the training aircraft, he saw the future of aviation. A future where talent and dedication mattered more than appearances, where everyone had a chance to prove themselves. "You know what the best part is?" he said to the CEO. "My daughter visited last week. She saw what we're doing here, saw how things are changing. She said it gave her hope for her own future in engineering." The CEO nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. Sometimes it takes one moment, one mistake, one choice to change everything. You chose to learn from your mistake rather than hide from it. That's made all the difference. As the sun set over the training center, Thomas gathered his materials for tomorrow's class. The photos of his first graduating class would soon join those on the walls. Proof that change was possible, that growth never stopped, and that true professionalism meant more than just wearing a uniform with pride.